All right, guys, so today we are going to be looking again at different representations of linear functions, and then we're going to be comparing two different companies. So we have the Math Club is planning a trip to the state math league competition. The contest is 140 miles from school, so we're going to underline the important information. The rental fees charged by two rental car companies are modeled in the graph and table below. Which rental car company gives the better deal? Justify your answer. Also in the parentheses it says, don't forget the students need to drive to the competition and then return home. Okay, so that's an important piece of information as well. Okay, so the first thing that we need to think about is we need to think about what mileage are we going to be looking at, because we can see that the rental fee is dependent upon what miles are being driven. And I can tell that by looking at the labels on the graph and the table for Carla's Cars to Go and Vince's Vans. Okay, so if we are pricing out a 140 mile trip away from the school, but we have to return home, then the total mileage is going to be what? Well, we have to drive out and we have to drive back. So the total mileage is going to be a 280 mile trip. Okay, so first thing we need to do is we need to look at this graph for Carla's Cars to Go, and we're looking for 280. So first I need to figure out like what I'm counting by on my X and my Y axis. That way I can find the correct values that I'm looking for. And if I look, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 blocks between 0 and 100. So it looks like I'm counting by 20s on the x-axis. So 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. Okay, so I'm counting by 20s on the x-axis. And then it looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the y-axis. So 0 to 50, 5 spaces means I'm counting by 10s on the y-axis. So if I'm looking at Carla's Cars to Go for 280 mile trip, I'm going to go to 220, 40, 60, 80. I go to 280 and I'm going to trace it up to my point. And then I'm going to take that point and trace it over to my y-axis to get that total cost. Okay, so it looks like that total cost is going to be $120. So Carla's is going to cost $120, and that was kind of nice because it was right on the grid line. So Carla's we've got. Now let's look at Vince's Vans. So I don't see 280 in the table, but I know that it falls in between those two values. So 280 miles is going to fall between 250 and 300. It's gonna be closer to 300 miles because 280 is closer to 300 than it is to 250. So that means that the price is gonna be closer to 135. So we're gonna have to make an estimate here, but we're gonna say that Vince's, is closer to $135, but it's kind of hard for us to tell exactly the price for Vince's Vans. So the better deal based on just what we have here appears to be Carla's. And the reason being, and you could state this in your own words, but the reason is we know Carla's charges $120 and Vince's is closer to 135 than 112.50. Okay. Even though we don't know exactly what Vince's is, this is a good estimate So we can make that call. Okay, so let's take a look. Let's keep on going. We're going to answer the following questions about Vince's vans. Okay, so was the table useful when you were determining which rental company had the better deal? So do we think that was useful? I mean, kind of. So I'm going to say a little. I could tell the charge would be between $112.50 and $135. So I couldn't get exactly, but I could get a rough estimate. So it was somewhat useful. Were there any disadvantages? So I would say like the major disadvantage for me is that I couldn't tell the exact cost. For 280 months. Would another representation have been more useful? We could say a table scaled differently. So like a table that included 280 would have been useful. And so would the rule. Because the rule we could just plug right in. We could calculate the exact cost. Okay. All right, we're going to look at Carla's now. Okay, was the graph useful for Carla's? I mean, I think the graph was useful because the point fell right on a grid line and we could find the exact amount. Were there any disadvantages to using the graph? Not in this case, because it did fall on the grid line. And would another representation have been more useful? If so, why? I mean, again, I would say not in this case for me, because we were specifically asked about 280 miles. All right, so the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at when we're trying to compare relationships. So when we're trying to compare relationships, it's usually a good idea to look at the same representation. Okay, so we want to look at either two tables or two graphs or two lines on the same graph, two rules. It's easier to compare when you have the same representation. So we're going to create the same representation. And first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a table for Carla's. Okay, so I'm looking at Carla's and I have 20, and all I'm going to do is pull the points. So I have 20, 40, 60. So I have the point 40, 60, and then I have the point 80, 70. And then I have the point 120, 80. And you can kind of see a pattern developing here, hopefully. We're adding 40 in the X column. So my next one would be 160, 200, 240, 280, 320, even though we don't have that on the table or in the graph. That's the last one that we have. So 90, 100, 110, 120, and I'm just extending this pattern from the table, but you could also look at the graph and just plot the points from the graph into the table. And then Vince's we already know, so I'm just going to real quick fill in Vince's. So we have 50, 100, 150, 200, 250, and 300, and that's 2250, 45, 67, 50, 90, 112, 50, and 135. Okay, so now that we have both of those, we can kind of figure out what we're going to scale this with. But before we scale, we definitely want to label. So remember, our x-axis from our graph above was miles driven, and our y-axis was rental cost. Okay. All right, and if we look at our x-axis, we are going from 0 all the way up to 320. So I think that the labels that they used on Carla's is sufficient, so we can just count by 20s. And I'm not going to count, and I'm going to count by 20s, but I'm not going to label everything. I'm going to do the same thing that they did in our notes above, and just every fifth one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I'm going to label with the 100. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm just copying that scale from Carla's graph. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I can get all the way up to 400 on my x-axis. And then on the y-axis, it looks like they counted by tens. And I think that we can probably do that as well. Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. So we're gonna count by tens. So 10, 20, 30, 40, and I'm gonna label it just like it was labeled above, by just labeling every fifth one. And the top one is gonna be 200. Okay, and then we're just going to plot these points. So for Carla's, 40, 60, 80, 70, and 20, okay, and I'm just plotting those, and I just extended the pattern. The pattern, if you could see, was up 1 over 2, up 1 over 2, which is really up 10 over 2, or up 10 over 20. Okay, so I plotted my points, I extended the pattern a little bit to give me more of a picture. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to graph Vince's as well. So we have 50, 22, 50. So 20, 40, 50 is going to be right here in the middle. And 22, 50, gosh, that's going to be really hard for me to graph. So you know what I think I'm going to do? I think that I am going to skip to the ones that are not decimals, and I think I'm just going to plot 145, because I know 45 is exactly halfway between 40 and 50. And then what do I have? 290, which is right on a grid line. And then what else do I have? 300, 135. So here's 100, 10, 20, 30, 35. And then I guess I can work that backwards too to fill that in. Okay, and then, okay. All right, so we can kind of see here, if I draw these lines in, and I'm going to do the best I can to get it somewhat straight. And I'm going to do the same with Carla's. And it is a good idea to label these. So I'm going to label my purple one Carla's and my blue one Vince's. Okay. And when we are looking at 280, so we're going to do number 2, which is describe in words how the two companies' prices compare. So if we are looking at a 280-mile trip, that's going to be right here. So do you see how if we look at 280, which is right here, 280 miles, do you see how we hit the pink line first? That means that Carla's costs less. Okay, so Carla's costs less because her line is lower than Vince's. Okay, and if we talk about the comparison, so I'm going to go back up and I'm going to answer this question right here, number 2. If we describe in words how the company's prices compare, if we look, who is cheaper in the beginning? Which line is lower in the beginning? It's the blue line. So Vince's starts out cheaper. But then around, let's see, around what value? Around here. So let's look. Around 220 miles. Carla's becomes cheaper. Okay, and that's all we're doing when we're talking about a comparison. We're just looking, and do you see how when you have the same representation, it's very easy when you have both of them graphed in the same representation, it's easier to kind of make a call instead of looking at a table versus looking at a graph. It's easier to see the information in the same way.